worth still fighting for. And I think if you're interested in building a better world, then you have to have democracy. That's the only way it's going to be achieved, by having a democratic system. And I would be very happy with a world government system. I would be very happy with a European government. But I'm not happy with one which is not democratic. It has to be democratic. And the European Union just isn't democratic. It poses as democratic, as a parliament, but parliament doesn't really have much power. It's largely a rubber stamping mechanism, and it's the unelected bureaucrats or the European Commission on the whole which has the power to do things. So it's not responsive to ordinary people's desires. That is the big problem. The other problem is, or the other issue is, in relation to democracy, is that we had a referendum in 2016. And I think it has to be respected. If it isn't respected, if the majority of wishes of people aren't carried out, then it seriously compromises our institutions. It seriously compromises democracy. Now, if you look at what's happening in Scotland, there's demands for another referendum. And you have to ask yourself, well, if they vote to leave, what's going to happen? If it's already been, the precedent has always been set that we don't have to take any notice of referendums, then clearly, there's not much hope for Scottish independence or any other kind of vote. Right, okay, so that's my political position, I guess. And now I'm going to put my more sociological hat on and just sort of have a bit of an observation about what's really Brexit all about. What's driving it? And I would say that, straight after as soon as the shock result of the referendum was announced, there was this desperation to try and explain what it was about. But it was a very clumsy explanation. It all concentrated on finding out the characteristics of those people who voted. What's wrong with these people? They didn't vote our way. They didn't do as we suggested. Typically, so they were sort of caricature. So typically they were seen as uneducated. They didn't have very much education, and therefore they couldn't really understand what they were doing. There's the age-old argument against democracy that, if you're not educated, i.e. if you're working class, you're not capable of really exercising a proper decision. Turkey's voting for Christmas, a very patronising idea, this idea that, they didn't really, these are the poorest people and they didn't really know what they were doing. They don't know what's best for them. Only we, the elite, the educated, know what's best. They were led astray. This is again another one that anti-democrats always use against voting, against black people, women, and the working class having the vote, that they're led astray by autocrats. There's a lot of talk about populism. It's used very clumsily, not in any really sophisticated social scientific way, but just to basically say, working class people, if they don't vote the way we want to, and there's a load of people voting for them because of they're scapegoating immigrants or something, this is a bad thing. There's no real sort of proper analysis of what's happening here. Another characteristic of Leave voters is that they're chauvinist, they're Little Englanders, nostalgic, they have a nostalgia for imperialism. Forget the contradiction between actually Little Englanders were against imperialism actually originally, that phrase came from, because they were only interested in reforming at home in England, not imperialism abroad. And the other thing is that this is maybe one of the things that I'm going to focus on, because I think you'll be most interested in this, is the idea that, they were predominantly white people voted for Leave, and therefore they must be racist. Actually a third of ethnic minorities voted for to Leave, but they ignore that largely and say, well, it is a racist vote. And it's basically an attempt to delegitimise. These people aren't good enough, therefore it doesn't really count. We have to annul the result. So I want to take up this point about nostalgia for imperialism or chauvinism. I think the people who are doing this, they're drawing on old models. So, clearly after the Second World War, and before it, there was this link between racism and imperialism, and the justification of imperialism was based on these very overt racist, the idea of the superiority of the white European. It became toned down. After the Second World War, they had to tone it down because these sort of overt racist ideology had been compromised by fascism. So it took a more subtle version. But that, I would say, is still essentially, this subtle version is part of the European ideal. this idea that there's something best about European people, which makes them, something, we all have something in common. We're white and we're European, we have something in common. And indeed, Guy Verhofstadt, recently he said, we need a European imperialism. You've got to understand, you British people, that this is in your interest to go forward with European imperialism. And when you look at it, who are the main members of the European Union? Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Netherlands, Germany. Who are these? These are the old imperialists, aren't they? They're the old colonialists. Why on earth would you look to them to fight imperialism if you were anti-imperialist? I can't think of anything more absurd, this idea that these people, these unelected accountable leaders of these imperialist countries, are going to fight imperialism. Okay, you can see I'm losing much more of my time than I realise. Okay, so the other thing is racism. This idea that those people who voted Leave were basically racists. And the argument is well, they were anti-immigrant. Some of the research, a lot of the research says an important issue was this whole issue of immigration. It blames immigrants or ethnic minorities for the problems that we face: housing shortages, low wages, unemployment. So therefore, calling for immigration control, it blames ethnic minorities, it blames immigrants, and therefore it creates this atmosphere of racism. But of course, I think you've got to acknowledge here that actually all the mainstream parties, for all of the post-war period, have been pro-control of immigration, always. Since 1948, there's been a whole sort of raft of different legislation governing immigration, desperately trying to restrict it, playing with words, desperately trying to find a rule that would discriminate against black immigrants, essentially, but allow white immigrants in. So they were always very happy for Europeans to come in. They encouraged Europeans to come into Britain in the post-war period, white Americans, and what they really wanted, of course, they wanted to allow free movement from the old colonies of their white families and the white people to come to Britain. That was okay. What they really wanted to do is exclude black people. That's always been the focus of immigration laws, and it still is today. So all the main parties do it. So why would we then say, well, okay, these Leave voters want to control immigration? Most people do. I'm actually against immigration controls myself. I believe you shouldn't have any. And I was involved in left-wing activities a while back, and anti-racist campaigns. And we always recognised the fact that to fight racism, you had to oppose immigration control because they were the cutting edge of racism. I'm not sure whether that still is the case today, but I still think you've got to, you've got to ask the question. Firstly, how does opposing Brexit oppose racism? I would think that if you want to oppose racism, you need an anti-racist campaign. Now, maybe if you think that immigration controls are the main focus of racism, then obviously you need a campaign against immigration controls. You need to highlight the appalling racism of Fortress Europe, which really just consolidates the post-war national immigration policies, brings it all together, and it divides up the labour market between the white citizens, European citizens, and the non-white others, the immigrants, the Africans, the Asians, the Arabs, that are seen as a problem. So you can look at Trump, forget Trump and his wall in Mexico. Fortress Europe, EU have already done it, and it's the most policed, heavily surveyed, barbaric border in the world. There's nothing worse than it. And you can look at the people dying in the Mediterranean and ask yourself, well, why are they drowning? Why did they cross the Mediterranean in these unseaworthy boats? Because they can't go the same routes as you, as me, and other European citizens can take. They're denied that route. Okay, so I still think this ideology is very much there today. And is very much part, this ideology of racism and imperialism is very much part of the European Union. It's more toned down than it was in previous, and it's more talked about in terms of culture, wanting to promote us, European culture. But that essentially is what it's about. Okay, just finish off then. I would say, you know, I would argue that the reason why I want to leave the European Union is I want to get rid of immigration controls. I'm pro-democracy, and I think those two, anti-racism and democracy, aren't exclusive. I think they're very much part. You know, there's always been a tradition of fighting for equality, whether it's women's, black people's equality, working class equality. It has always been about democratic rights, that we all have the same rights, that we all have the right to vote. So I think as part of any anti-racist campaign or any pro-equality campaign, we have to campaign and ensure that we fight for our democratic rights. Okay? Probably gone over a little bit.
Contending, contradictory, to some extent even incommensurate discourses about the significance of Brexit. On the one side, there's a discourse that emphasizes xenophobia and racism, propagated in the academy by the likes of Nadina Adni, Guminder Bhamra, and Satnam Virdi, who would locate Brexit, quote, in the pragmatics of race, citizenship, and empire, and who view Brexit as reflecting a public mood of, quote, post-colonial melancholia, and who thereby apply a hermeneutic of suspicion, interpreting the dynamics surrounding Brexit as driven fundamentally by a deeply ingrained, if resurgent, bout of what they call xeno-racism. On the other side, there's a discourse that stresses instead sovereignty and democracy, propagated in the academy by the likes of Chris Bickerton here at Cambridge, David Lane here at Emmanuel, and our friend here, Mark Ramsden, who would insist instead that Brexit should be interpreted as first and foremost a people's revolt against the undemocratic, bureaucratic, and neoliberal straitjacket that is the European Union. Now, each of these discourses undoubtedly captures part of the truth. In fact, one of the principal virtues of the Leave campaign's most memorable slogan, "Take Back Control," at least insofar as campaign slogans can be said to possess virtues at all, was its success in appealing simultaneously to the xeno-racist and the democratic impulses of the populist, at least insofar as these two impulses can be treated as separate at all. An appeal to the dark side of democracy, perhaps. But what I want to do is come in with some sociological evidence that gives more credibility to the first discourse, the discourse that this is about xeno-racism, this is about the dark side of democracy, so to speak. So the interpolation of xeno-racist impulses of the populace over the course of the referendum campaign was most blatantly performed by the man who arguably did the most to set the agenda. The guy who was formerly the head of the United Kingdom Independence Party and now is the head of the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage. And I don't know how many of you have seen the famous poster with the Syrian refugees lined up and it said, "Breaking point, take back control." Okay, so that, I think that image speaks a lot about what was being interpolated, what was being appealed to. Now, further buttressing the plausibility of the discourse of xeno-racism is the fact that the far right seems so emboldened by the Brexit victory, as evidenced most dramatically by the unprecedented spike in religious and racially motivated hate crimes that took place in the wake of the referendum result. And finally, and this is what I'll spend most of the time here talking about, there is evidence that can be culled from the copious public opinion survey-based research that has proliferated on the subject of Brexit. The people who run the British Social Attitude Survey concluded that the issue of immigration was at the heart of the Brexit vote, with fully 73% of those who registered concerns about immigration voting in favor of Brexit, compared with 36% who did not register any such concerns. Now, attitudes about immigration are themselves endogenous to broader processes, both political and social. They are mediated, so to speak. And in Britain, the tabloid press has played an especially nefarious role in propagating a toxic ideological climate, manufacturing a comic book consciousness of sorts, one in which the migrant come refugee appears as a familiar, stock character, portrayed as a villain upon whom public fears and anxieties can be conveniently projected. Day in and day out, British people are inundated with images and headlines encouraging them to view migrants in almost exclusively negative terms. The tabloid press repeatedly informs people, 1, that there are too many migrants, that they come in floods, swarms, and hordes. 2, that migrants are criminals portrayed as illegals, as thieves, even murderers. 3, that migrants are stealing our jobs. And 4, that when they are not stealing our jobs, they are taking advantage of our benefits. Indeed, that they are benefit scroungers. No wonder the moral panic surrounding the subject. Furthermore, survey research compellingly shows that those most susceptible to being successfully interpolated by such negative depictions of immigrants, that is, those who come to accept such depictions at face value, also tend to prove susceptible to being successfully interpolated by a whole host of other right-wing reactionary appeals. So much so that registering concern about immigration is often taken as one of the main indicators of possessing an authoritarian value orientation. And in fact, according to the British Social Attitudes Survey, among those categorized as possessing such authoritarian values, fully 72% registered support for Brexit, compared with a mere 21% of those categorized as possessing libertarian values. If we break it down further, we find, for example, that whereas only 29% of those who register favorable attitudes towards multiculturalism supported leave, fully 81% of those with negative attitudes towards multiculturalism did. Likewise, whereas approximately 40% of those who register favorable attitudes towards feminism supported leave, among those who have negative attitudes towards feminism, support for leave rose to 74%. Similarly, among those with favorable attitudes towards the Green Movement, support for Brexit was a mere 38%, compared with fully 78% of those who reject the Green Movement. In sum, evidence from survey research would seem to validate the discourse of those who emphasize xeno-racism as a crucial interpretive key for understanding Brexit. But this is only part of the story revealed by survey research. For such research also shows that attitudes towards Brexit vary quite significantly across cohorts divided by age, educational levels, class, partisan preferences, racial identity, religious identity, national identity, and region as well. How much time do I have left?
I'm ready to speak.
So the generational factor is particularly stark, with close to 3/4 of those between 18 and 24 preferring Remain, compared with only 40% of those over 65. So too did educational level correlate quite strongly with preferences, with less than 1 in 3 of those with no qualifications opting for Remain, compared with approximately 2/3 of those with university degrees. Somewhat less stark, though still clear, were the differences among people belonging to different class categories, with close to 6 in 10 of those belonging to the highest class category preferring Remain, compared with approximately 4 in 10 of those belonging to the lowest class category. In terms of partisan preferences, just over 40% of conservative voters opted for Remain, compared with close to 2/3 of Labour voters. And race mattered too, with just under half of those who identify as white opting for Remain, compared with 7 in 10 of those who identify as BME. Likewise, religion, with only 4 in 10 of those describing themselves as Christians opting for Remain, compared with nearly 7 in 10 of those who describe themselves as Muslims. So too with region. We see in Scotland, it's 60% in favor of Remain. In Northern Ireland also, a clear majority of 55%. And a similarly clear majority of Londoners, 55% opted for Remain. And interestingly, and I'll come to an end here, in terms of national identification, it's really interesting. The stronger the sense of Englishness one registers vis-a-vis Britishness, the more likely one was to prefer Brexit. So if you ask people, do you feel British, more British than English, all the way over to only English, while less than 4 in 10 of those who identify as British, not English, opted for Brexit, the proportion rose to over 7 in 10 of those who identify as English, not British. Now, such are the relations revealed by the surveys. The numbers provide us with a map of sorts, allowing us to glimpse how attitudes and reported voting behavior, in this case, about Brexit, are embedded within the broader constellations of material and social power relations. However, numbers alone are ultimately limited in their ability to help us adjudicate among contending interpretations about the significance of any complex social phenomenon. And so hopefully we'll have time for discussion where we can talk about the real significance of these numbers. But I think the numbers are clear enough in terms of what seemed to be driving the vote towards Brexit, and it wasn't about democracy.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We'll move over to
point of view. I am currently a student leader in the University of Cambridge. University of Cambridge, and today I also have the responsibility of representing the university side on this. I would like to start with an anecdote. So this was in the Remain campaigning phase, essentially. And we went door-to-door knocking to various places in Cambridge. And much of what Professor Riley here said was fairly evident, and I'll start with that essentially, because I think in terms of the interactions we had on the ground, in terms of the points of discussion, so to say, I think the points were fairly to do with various subsistence-related, propaganda-related, and perception-related ideological points, and points of debate as well. And one instance when we were trying to kind of negotiate with them in terms of what is it that they know and what is it that they could know more about it, I still remember it was a slap on our face, basically, because they felt that we didn't know what we were talking about. They felt that the European Parliament was not democratic. With all due respect, I think that was the point put forward by the first speaker. And there were bits and pieces to do with economics as well, which I'll be coming to soon. But before going to that, I feel that because Brexit is such an important political exercise, it is the exercise with the largest democratic mandate ever in the United Kingdom. In absolute terms, I think John Major's victory in '92 was more in terms of percentage, but regardless of that, I think there is a correlation with respect to hate crimes, and it is strange that when we have 8 million BNE people in the country, which is more than the populations of Scotland and Wales combined, I see a certain reluctance, or at least a complete ignorance of the perspectives that the BAME community has, be it in terms of consultations, be it in terms of interactions with NGOs, with civil society, bodies, and that I find is fairly problematic in itself. But I'll come to that later on, but what I would like to focus on, which I raised earlier, was the economic aspect of it. Recently there was a study by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the IFS, which projects that the hard Brexit option leaves people in fairly insecure jobs in plants, in various other industries, much worse off than people who are in obviously secure jobs, in the blue-collar jobs, so to say. And it's very interesting to see the sociological aspect to that, in terms of the identities of people involved in those sectors. So obviously you have a lot of people from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from various African countries as well. There is a significant amount of BAME population that is part of that cross-section of the population. And there is a certain study, the study goes on to say that they will be the ones who will be most affected. Now that is, and I go back to the point of participation of these people in the consultation, in the democratic exercise, in the political exercise. I don't see enough. I don't see something which is proportionate to the effect that it will have on the ground, and this does not come from just the academic point of view, but with respect to consultations. I have been part of the Labour and Lib Dem Remain campaign, and thereafter we have had consultations with people in Cambridge, and we have a wider network across the country as well. So in that respect, I think there is a glaring problem on that front. There was an interesting point raised, which I was anyway wanting to come to, which is that anti-Brexit and anti-racism, right? The fact that if you are for Brexit, then you have a certain stance on racism. Well, the facts for you are this. After Brexit, we had an increase of hate crimes by 31 a day, or 638 a month. Now, this is interesting also because of the way in which media came into the picture. So if you look at, there's a whole study done on the way in which certain concepts and certain ideas are put forth in newspapers, in media outlets. They included things like migration, migrants, various topics of interest related to Brexit. And the correlation between that and the way in which hate crimes increased has been extensively studied. And if anyone is interested, I could forward the papers to you. And it is interesting because around that time, there was a Finsbury Park attack a few days later, and there is a sharp spike in terms of hate crimes around the period of the referendum, and thereafter there was a certain kind of a dip, and then thereafter again after the attacks there was another rise. And on the ground again, reports very much say that there is this, with all due respect, this nostalgia of sorts to what Britain should be in terms of the European exercise, in terms of what is internationalism and cooperation on that front, and how the authority and the integrity and independence of Westminster should be above all else in certain ways. which is fairly legitimate. I mean, sovereignty of every country is something which I respect quite a bit. But at the same time, cooperation and the way in which negotiations are done on the international and diplomatic level are also important. And I think the studies, especially by LSE on this, say a very different picture to what my esteemed co-speaker just now mentioned. With regards to the idea of, so I'll come to this idea of decolonization as well slightly, because I think the perspective that is brought to the fore is that there isn't a very direct or a very kind of evident form in which the correlation so-called exists. But obviously it's in the modern age that has never been the case in various ways. It has always been fairly subtle, it has been fairly implied and fairly indirect in some ways. And that is an area where again people have studied that, and I am personally interested in that because in the university we have a campaign against unconscious bias and implicit bias. We have bits and pieces on how this comes out in very subtle ways as well. And I don't want to kind of bring that together directly, but at the same time I would like to raise the point that even within Cambridge there have been instances where it has come up in various ways, and even in the UK. So there have been verdicts passed, there have been interactions with people in civil society as well, which has been skewed in a certain direction. So I'd not like to speak more at the moment because I'd be interested in the question and answer session. But because today I'm representing the university as well, I think it's my responsibility to highlight that for Brexit as well as for race equality, there are various points of support and information that are available. I'd be more than happy to discuss this further. This includes central university provisions and college-based race harassment contacts, essentially. I think it's very important at this time to make people aware, especially the student community, and I'd like to take this platform to do that. So I think I'd leave it at that.
Sort of things affecting what's happening day to day. But what I'd like to do is take a much higher overview of the proceedings, and I'd like to talk about two broad areas. One is about power and money, and the other is about something that I think about as more general values. And I'll start briefly with the general values, and to my mind it's probably another clunky term for what I think we as a species have singularly failed to address, but I think we could very easily address. And by general values I mean our beliefs about what our fellow humans are entitled to. Many of these things are what the UN Charter on Human Rights describes as rights, but it's quite interesting how many of them are still highly contested, and there's a key part of that contest which is, I think, core to the capitalist ideology. But the fact that people have a right to accommodation, a living wage, to not be in food poverty, I think these should be givens at this point in our society, but they're not. They're still points that are highly debated. And they're vital because if you don't acknowledge that, then pretty much anything is up for grabs. So when we have these discussions about Brexit will disadvantage the poorest communities in this country, that doesn't really fly because there is a very dominant ideology about the fact that poverty is the fault of the poor. That poverty is something that occurs because you haven't worked hard enough. It's part of a broader approach within that ideology that we will not talk about systemic problems or systemic factors. We will talk about individual failures and individual solutions. And individual failures can often be the failure to implement individual solutions. You should have worked harder. You should have studied more. And that's why you're in this position. Whereas all of these things are shaped so clearly through history, through massive systemic factors, which continue to play out. So that comes to the matter of power and money. And essentially when one wants to look at the Brexit world, or indeed a lot of political maneuverings, we at our level, and I think of us as people who don't have direct power, talk about it in terms of what is happening at this level, the level that we can actually engage in to explain what has happened here. Whereas in reality, all of these movements have been shaped by people with power, and people who want money, and people who have control. The Brexit vote didn't arise as a grassroots movement. The Tea Party did not arise as a grassroots movement. These are all things that have been funneled down from up. All these explanations, these ideologies, these stories of what have been sold and shaped to the general public by people in power. But one of the great things about being in power is that you can always define the terms of reference. You can say, well, here's where we are now. Let's talk about why we're here. We needn't talk about how we got here. We needn't talk about who's brought us here. We needn't talk about who profits from where we are. But, you know, we're here now. We've done this. Let's discuss this, right? We'll talk on this level. And that is something that power has very beautifully maneuvered. And when one thinks of all the various movements and changes that have brought us to this point, everywhere you have to recognize the role of power. One classic example is the idea of balance in reporting. The idea of balance in reporting can be caricatured as I may be a racist, I may be a climate change denier, but I have a right to have my opinion heard, and because it's my opinion, it's right. And you've got to think, that isn't something that a poor racist or a poor climate change denier came up with and fought for the right to have their voice heard. That is very much a move from power. I am in power, I don't believe in climate change, I am a racist, of course I don't think of myself as that, but I demand to have my voice heard. And I possess power and money to shape the organizations and systems that will allow me to do that. And in a similar way, we've got to recognize, as we all know, when we somehow sort of blank out, that actually a lot of our political structure, our political economy, the global geopolitical economy is shaped by power and money, right? So when we talk about this is democracy, that has to be heavily caveated, right? The people who shaped the entire campaign, the people who built everything for it, and the people who are still fighting for it are not fighting for democracy. This is not about democracy, right? The way that this entire thing was shaped, the way in which the messaging was delivered, the fact that the referendum was illegal on so many counts is something that is surprisingly not discussed. And you've got to think, who's got the power to actually keep that out of the discussion, right? That's been shown repeatedly, and you can see clearly that as it's advanced, there's even less attempt to try and cover it up by the perpetrators of that crime. So when we talk about Brexit being an exercise in democracy, we've got to take it with the same pinch as to what exactly is democracy, right? And who exactly controls and shapes our democracy. What is this about, and who actually stands to profit from it? So when I say about defining the terms of reference, one very dangerous way of defining the terms of reference is we voted for this. This was a democratic vote. It wasn't, right? This was a mess on several levels that serves very specific people's agendas, and they've not been shy about saying it. Crispin Odey is highly outspoken about what his motivations are. We know who Nigel Farage's and Boris Johnson's backers are. So why do we persist with this illusion that somehow this is something that we at this level have control over? I certainly agree with all of the points that Jeff has raised. I think what has been draped over this power move are several bits of ideology, several bits of narrative, several bits of nostalgia that will appeal to people, that will make them fight for it. But I again put to you that actually, what exactly do you gain? And that's the thing that is most surprising. Brexit stands to actually seriously disadvantage lots and lots of people. It's not going to disadvantage the people in power and the people with money. So why exactly are we pressing forward with this? Because like in many of these discussions, those people are dispensable. They're dispensable to the overall discussion. It doesn't matter if these communities are going to be wiped out. It doesn't matter that Nissan and all these are going to move out to areas in which they basically sustain the economy, because those people don't really count in this discussion. I'm going to just finish off with a couple of things on the ground. I look after people with serious mental illness who are, at the best of times, a highly, highly disadvantaged section of society. they are going to be affected by changes in the health service. They are going to be seriously affected by changes in drug delivery because most of my patients are on long-term treatment, right? They get a raw deal wherever they go. This is going to be an even rawer deal, right? And of course, let's not talk about pressures in terms of staffing. At the moment, I can say this because this is something I have tweeted with consent, right? I have tried to find what I can do to help a patient of mine who is being deported by the Home Office to a country that he sought asylum from 18 years ago, where he's destined to end up back in prison at the very best. He has no connection, and there is no treatment available for his mental illness. And he's being deported because of offences that he committed. The offences in the scheme of things are not major offences, but critically, they are all offences that were clearly tied to his mental illness. They all occurred because he was unwell, right? And I have written to the Home Office to state that this is what has happened. And having provided that information, they then sent me and my colleague, as his mental health service provider, the letter of his deportation and asked us to convey it to him. Right? This is the nature of the system that's actually operating in the country, but it suits people to keep us debating things at this level where we either punch one level up, punch to the side, or punch down. But don't even think about looking there where all this is coming from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hisham. That was